session is entitled Sense of Place, and I'll introduce Phil in a minute, but a few words about Phil before I do that, and he begins. I'm delighted and honored to introduce Phil. I first met him a few years ago in Washington, D.C., when we were judging design awards for a competition for the Society for Experiential Graphic Design. And immediately, I was impressed by his knowledge, his calm temperament, and his thoughtful approach. Phil Freelon is known for his imaginative design and thoughtful collaboration. He's the managing director and design director for Perkins & Will in the USA, where he practices architecture that engages the community and enhances opportunities for interaction and learning. Phil's achievements include cultural, civic, and academic projects for some of America's most respected cultural institutions. As many of you know, Phil led the 4-firm design team for the new Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. He is the design architect for the National Center for Civil and Human Rights in Atlanta. His portfolio also includes the Museum of the African Diaspora in San Francisco, the Emancipation Park in Houston. Phil is President Obama's, good words there, appointment to the National Commission of Fine Arts, a Fellow of the American Institute of Architects, and a recipient of the Thomas Jefferson Award for Public Architecture. Before I turn it over to Phil, I would also like to acknowledge Phil's wonderful wife, Nina, a highly accomplished jazz musician and singer. Sorry, Phil, but you were clearly upstage the other evening at the US Embassy when Nina performed a song at that reception. It was truly uplifting and set the perfect tone for this week's summit in Buenos Aires, and I really thank you for that. So with that, I'll turn over to you, Phil.
Thank you very much. As you might imagine, it's not the first time we've performed together and I've been upstage. I'm happy that... Well, I'm certainly happy to be here. Thank you for the invitation. And as I thought about the theme for the conference, it really did resonate with me as the collaboration of architecture and exhibit design and curators and administrators and students. This is really the core of telling the message and getting the story through to the visitor experience. And so I'm going to talk about 4 projects from the very small to the very large and speak a bit about how those influences have shaped not only the architecture, but blending the design of the building with the visitor experience and the exhibit design, which I think is very crucial. And so we talk about infiltrating the urban fabric, and so these projects are part of their environment. The context in which our institutions are located is crucial. We don't stand on islands. We have to consider our neighbors, the community around it, and all of the input that is necessary as we build these institutions. And so the first project is the Museum of the African Diaspora in San Francisco. And this is the Yerba Buena section of San Francisco. And some of you who know the city will remember that years ago, this was a rundown area, Skid Row. It was a place you did not want to go in the evenings. It was dangerous. But the city of San Francisco decided to invest in this area and make it a cultural destination. And so we see that there is the Yerba Buena Center for the Arts, Performing Arts, and the Visual Arts, the Moscone Center, the Convention Center, and so on, and the Yerba Buena Gardens. And so this has become a magnet for tourism and a model for redevelopment using the arts in the center of one of the United States' most important cities. And this arrow indicates one of the developments there. It's the St. Regis Museum Tower, a 5-star hotel and condominium. And part of the development arrangement for this facility was a cultural component. And so we were hired to try and determine what would be best suited for that space, 20,000 square feet, a small area in comparison to the rest of the building, but nonetheless an important location on the corner of 3rd and Mission. And so while we have a hotel condominium above, there is a moment on Mission Street where we were able to craft our own identity as the Museum of the African Diaspora. And one of the ways we did that was to try and distinguish our entry from all the other urban portals along that street. Of course, there's offices, retail, and so on. But we wanted to do something special here in the entrance and create an intervention that announced that something really fantastic was happening inside. We looked at ways of incorporating the architecture with the exhibitry, and this child's face, working with the graphic designers Sussman Prasia in a collaboration, we decided that we wanted this certain read of the face from a distance, but then as you get closer, you see the constituent images that begin to tell the story of the African diaspora. And the idea was to reach out into the street. There isn't a whole lot of sight. It's right on the edge of the urban fabric, not a lot of landscape. And so we wanted an image and a sort of reaching out to intrigue people, to have them see something other than an office building or a hotel, and to encourage and sort of enlighten folks to come in so that the building begins to tell the story of the African diaspora even before you get there. And that intervention I talked about is an orange canopy that penetrates the glass facade and creating that jewel box. Even the logo of MOAD is intended to tell the story. It's made up of dots of light because, as we know, the story of humanity started somewhere near Ethiopia when the first human beings stood up and began to move around, and that is what the story is about. Even as you walk along the street, as I said, there's not a lot in terms of sight and landscape, but we begin to tell that story. This is a text on the glass that defines the word diaspora. So as you're walking along, you see the intervention here, the orange canopy. You begin to get the story even before you enter. And as you go up the stair is used not only to bring you vertically from point A to point B, but to have that experience be part of the story of the African diaspora. So you see the constituent images along the stairway, sound is coming out, so you have an auditory piece of it with music and spoken words, so that travel from one floor to the next is part of the experience as well. In Charlotte, North Carolina, the Gantt Center for African American History and Culture is part of this southern city. Charlotte, North Carolina is really the banking center for that part of the U.S. With many banks. They have their headquarters here. But one of the things we learned in our research and in engaging the public here was that, years ago, this area of the city that's marked in green, that was the neighborhood back during the days of segregation where the African American community had pretty much a standalone city of their own. Segregation sort of forced this, but at the same time it was a source of pride for the residents there. But over time, two things happened. First, there was urban renewal, and we know this story, it's a familiar one in the US, where those communities slowly were eroded and dismantled in the name of urban renewal. And so the highway came through, and then the good part about it was segregation was ended, and so the need for separate communities went away. But those two factors led to the notion that this community needed to be commemorated in some way because it was such a vibrant and an active place. And what happened was in that part of Charlotte, there was a cultural district beginning to develop. We see the Beckler Museum by Mario Botta. There's a new development here, the Night Theater, the Mint Museum, Machado and Silvetti. So there was a cultural district starting to emerge here. Even the NASCAR Museum by Pay Cobb Freed was close by. And we had to convince our clients that this was an important site, even though the parameters of that site were very difficult. 55 feet by 400 feet. It was sort of a leftover piece of land. But we felt that the location was important enough that, that we could work with those difficult proportions. And in fact, as the architects in the room will tell you, sometimes the constraints and the difficulties of a particular problem lead you to a more imaginative solution. So we had to think about how could we nestle in that development there. And the reason that site is so long and narrow is it's an access ramp for parking and service for a mega structure right across the street. A mixed-use development that includes office, retail, condominium, and 10 levels of parking below grade. So keep this section in mind as we go through the design ideas for the Gantt Center. We had to pick the building up to allow for those ramps to continue on down. Back to the history for a moment. I mentioned the segregated South, and up through the 50s, there was a thriving African-American community there with their own institutions such as hospitals and theaters, and a really proud and thriving community that over time just disappeared. So we wanted to find a way to really pay homage to that history. And in our research and talking and engaging the community, we discovered this school. It was called the Myers School, but the nickname was the Jacob's Ladder School, because during times of graduation and other special events, the students and faculty would come out and get their pictures taken in front of the school. And that form for us, and this notion of Jacob's Ladder, it has an obvious biblical reference, but we also know that the community felt that education was the path to advancement in the U.S. And it was a very important gesture, and that building is long gone. We felt that there might be a way to commemorate that in the new structure. And so that form of Jacob's Ladder was an idea that we wanted to imbue in the building. We also looked at the patterns of quilting and textile patterns in West Africa as a clue about how the facade of the building might be arranged. And so those patterns were a driver for the design as well. And the partie, if you will, or the idea behind the building is Jacob's Ladder above the ramp system, but also the quilting pattern, the stitching together of the facade, and using that pattern as a driver for the exterior design. And this notion of quilting and making something out of nothing, taking a site that was left over, that was really very difficult, but making something beautiful out of pieces and parts. This is the building in place across from the freeway, and this leftover site then became a billboard and an entry announcement into Charlotte, welcoming people into that cultural district we talked about with the Mint Museum and the Beckler and so on. And so we've taken what was a throwaway site and made it a real feature in the city of Charlotte. Sorry, I keep going backwards. And you'll see that the facade has taken on that persona of the stitching and the quilting patterns. And Jacob's Ladder, you come in, you go up escalators and upstairs at both ends, and you arrive at the lobby above the street level, so that ramping system that leads to the parking below is there. And we can see the entry to the parking structure here, and you ramp down. But our Jacob's Ladder is in place in that facade that references back to the quilting. Here's the development below. There was a commissioned piece of artwork here that is in front of the truck ramp that enters at the end. Cars enter here. And so we were able to work around these very difficult constraints and create a facility that has been very successful, not only with regard to their programs and the exhibits that come there, but also as a revenue-producing facility where weddings and other special events occur here. And on the back side of the building, there will be a development here at some point in time. But in the meantime, we created a light sculpture and continued the motif of the stitching with a light sculpture along the back. And as you come up through the building at Jacob's Ladder, you arrive at the top, and the entrances to the galleries are just off of the lobby, so that there's no need for corridors, long corridors, because you enter right there. And when you're in those spaces, this is at the top of the building, where we have those rental opportunities for revenue. It really is a pleasant space looking over the city. When you're in the galleries themselves, you would never know you're in a long, narrow building, because the aspect ratio, the proportion of those spaces is quite right for the exhibition of art or even other displays that come in temporary exhibits. In Atlanta, Georgia, we won an international design competition for the National Center for Civil and Human Rights. And once again, we started with research. We started with engaging the community to see how can we really infuse meaning into the architecture, so that the building and the concept is not simply housing exhibits, but the architecture and the design is contributing to the message of that institution. And so we began to notice what we've all seen over the years, this idea of interlocking arms, and how together, even Dr. King back in the day and in current times, we see that this is an enduring icon that speaks to bringing people together, people of perhaps different ethnic backgrounds, different histories, ages, very diverse, and that coming together and linking in this way, you're stronger than you are as an individual. And so we wanted to find a way to perhaps bring that idea into the architecture. We also felt that the space around the building would be very important. Places like Tiananmen Square, the Mall on Washington, these are examples of civic spaces where people come together for a common cause. And so that was another notion that we felt would be appropriate for the Center for Civil and Human Rights, a space for action around the building and using the site for that purpose. And if you look at the site, we're on a busy corner. We have neighbors. The Georgia Aquarium is to this side. The Coca-Cola Museum is here. And so our site is an interesting topography. We're about 25 feet higher here than we are at this end. And so we're looking at two entrances on grade, but also using the area around the building for that space for action we talked about. Our process, as I mentioned, is very collaborative. We like using models and bringing the community in and getting feedback. And this is the building as it stands today. This is facing south, and so there is sun control to take care of the glare and heat gain. But also on the upper plaza, you're able to actually see some of the exhibitry through the glass. And as we did in San Francisco, we're using the building to announce what's in there. You don't simply cross the threshold and come in. We want to engage potential visitors as they approach the building. And the idea of really interlocking hands or interlocking arms is abstracted in the sense of the two walls that embrace the content of the building. And it's a subtle reference back to those interlocking arms we showed before. And as you move around the building from the upper plaza to the lower plaza, we find this landscape that terraces down and the stairway, and there are actually programs that occur, and you can have meetings and so forth outside and experience this facade. That again, it's a subtle reference to diversity, as we're seeing different tones of brown, that it's alluding in a way to the diverse nature of humanity. And the lower plaza features a commissioned piece of art, sculpture, water feature, where water comes down across words and quotes from Nelson Mandela and Martin Luther King. And so you can stand and read those quotes and see the water washing down and working with artists to incorporate the same geometry and reference to the building. This is the lower plaza. And here, and as I mentioned, some of the exhibitry is actually brought forward and working in close collaboration with Rockwell Associates, who were the exhibit designers. And this is something that we encourage when clients come to us, and they often talk about the architecture first, and then the exhibit designers are hired after. We always want to bring that aspect of the design in much earlier so that the building and the exhibits are integrated in a powerful way. On the upper level of that same space, you can begin to see the window patterns are reflected on the interior. Natural light is very important as you move through the exhibits, which are often technology driven, and therefore natural light can be a deterrent to telling that story. But when you come out, there's a refreshing moment of seeing the landscape and bringing in natural light before you re-enter. And so the exhibit on civil rights is on the middle level, and human rights is above that. And so there's a moment between the two of a refreshing view back into the city. And here, once again, we're using the staircase not simply to connect two different floors, but to be part of that experience moving up, making it a beautiful moment in the building, passing vertically in the architecture. And this is the lower level. And you can see where commissioned art and other visual cues are throughout the building, not just in the exhibits, but sparsed out throughout the public areas. And there's a spot in the lower level where the Martin Luther King papers are displayed. There are many different artifacts and not only written papers, but other memorabilia from Dr. Martin Luther King. And they're rotated throughout this small, intimate space with quotes embedded in the wooden walls. And it's meant to sort of simulate a space not dissimilar from the one we're in now, sort of a reverential reference back to his preaching days. There's a lot of technology here with screens that change, and they're interactive as well. And here, again, working very closely with the exhibit designer to make sure that the architecture and the exhibits are fully integrated. And finally, the night shot. Here's that stair that sweeps up and around to the upper plaza. I'm going to take the last few minutes to talk about the National Museum of African American History and Culture on the Mall in Washington, D.C. It's hard to imagine a more important site anywhere in the country, perhaps in the world. This is on the corner of Constitution Avenue, 15th Street, and 14th Street, and literally within the shadow of the Washington Monument, right in the middle of the monumental core of our nation's capital. This was an international design competition, and the team of Freelon, Bond, and the Smith Group working in collaboration. And once again, we had Ralph Applebaum Associates coming into play very early in the design process. And when you think about that site, it really is in proximity to some very important monuments around the Capitol. The Capitol building itself, archives. Here's the White House. This is the Lincoln Memorial. The Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial is here, and the Jefferson Memorial. So our site is visible from all of those, and just as importantly, we have views from the building back to those monuments. This site is also at a juncture where the National Mall, which is a very orthogonal, rectilinear development of the landscape, meets the more bucolic and organic form of the Washington Monument grounds. And so our site is really the transition point between those two. And so we've taken those organic forms and continued them through our site. But the building itself is square, just as its most important neighbor is square in plan, and the other museums along the mall. And so in that way, we're respecting the geometry and plan. And you can see here how the mall transitions from those alley of trees that are very regular and parallel into a more organic form here. And so we're right at the transition of those two geometries. Some of the drivers for the design include African American history, but also African history. We wanted the building to be, as in the others I've shown you, an expression of the idea, and I'm going to move more quickly, so that the building is speaking to the mission and vision of the institution. So celebration becomes an important part of that. Yes, there are difficult stories there, but we didn't want the building and the museum to be only about victims and perpetrators, but also about the celebration and the resiliency. The porch is an idea that is particularly strong in the South. It's a place where the landscape and the building merge together. You extend out into the landscape. And this is called a caryatid. It's a column figure from West Africa in the Yoruban culture. And that the top of it is called a corona or a crown, and that was a main driver for the design. These are some of the sketches with David Auger working in collaboration in a charrette format as we were working through the competition. And so the building then is a three-tiered corona, and the materiality was meant to be bronze, a material that suggests longevity, quality. And here's the porch on the southern side of the building, that welcoming gesture, a place where you can be protected from the harsh sun in Washington, D.C. It's very hot in the summer. There is a reflecting pool that creates almost a microclimate where the breezes come in and circulate. The dappled light on the underside of the porch is very beautiful as well. Sorry. And because the building is partially below grade, half of the building is below ground. So how do you bring light down? This is called the contemplative court. And it's a moment, as I mentioned in some of the other projects, where you can reflect and refresh in between looking at the exhibits. And this is also one level below, and you can begin to see some of the larger artifacts that happen there. Now, the pattern of the corona was derived from our research about the metalwork and ironwork that we see in places like New Orleans and Savannah, the South. And these are patterns and designs by African American enslaved, some free. And so this is a modern interpretation. The pattern of the corona is driven by those florets and twig shapes. And it's also variegated with regard to how much light is coming through. And so in that way we can regulate the heat gain, but we can also privilege certain views where it's important to see out, and then control other views by a more dense configuration of the same pattern. Many models were built to look at this. A full-scale mock-up was built to test this idea. These are construction shots. This is the main stair, monumental stair that connects the street level with the concourse level. And here you can begin to see how the dappled light and the filtered light from those corona panels is creating a pattern inside of the wall. And it really is a subtle reference back to those very beautiful ironwork patterns of the South. The building is complete. It opened in September. Very, very popular. It's difficult to get tickets. You have to go online, and I'm told that you have to wait until March of next year now to get a time to pass into the building. Here you can see how the corona on certain times of the day, it can appear almost on fire, just glowing. But then there are other moments where it's more subdued, and that is a dynamic aspect as you view the building across the day and even from season to season. And some interior shots here. This is an example of privileging certain views. So you come out of an exhibit and you look and you see the Washington Monument. There are other lenses, we call them lenses, where the other important monuments around Washington are featured. And A subtle reference back to our most important neighbor is the angle of the capstone of the Washington Monument is 17.5 degrees. The corona angle is that same dimension, 17.5 degrees in reverse. And so in this way, we are paying respect to our most important neighbor. And again, you know, depending on the time of day, even at night, the lighting from the inside was very carefully considered as it creates this glow. And so I'll end with that. Thank you very much.